Well, ladies and gentlemen, and for all of those joining us online, welcome to you as well. I know we're expecting about 300 of you to be joining us online. We really have a wonderful talk and the pleasure to hear a unique voice, a visionary futurenaut, an author, entrepreneur, and analyst of future trends. He co-founded Futera, a change agency that specializes in business transformation and creative communications and campaigns. His book, Only Planet, A Flight-Free Adventure Around the World, published in 2014, records his circumnavigation of the world without getting on a plane. Through his talk, we'll try to understand the complex challenges facing the world, from climate change to the current war in Ukraine, to get some actionable insights and to listen to the real questions that the future is asking. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ed Gillespie. And for those online, don't forget you have 30 minutes afterwards to ask him questions.
You'll be very relieved I'm not going to burst into song. Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's a huge honor to be presenting at this event. And my talk this morning is going to be about ensuring Earth is not our final frontier. I came here across the North Sea on a ferry yesterday, under the blue skies and sunshine, on a very calm mill pond of an ocean, then had to navigate the wrong passport channel when I arrived at the Hook of Holland, which is just a demonstration of the willful idiocy that humanity is capable of. But we'll come back to that in a moment. My relationship with space is quite superficial. I was, however, lucky enough 4 years ago to meet this incredible woman, Marsha Ivins, 5-time Space Shuttle mission veteran, who told me all sorts of wonderful things about what astronauts get up to off the news agenda. So including sticking a GoPro camera inside a bubble of water in the International Space Station so you can film what it looks like to be a bubble of water flowing through the International Space Station. But I want to talk about something a bit more hair-raising today. Marsha is famous for this particular image of her hair in zero gravity, because this is a cliched image. We all know this one, Earthrise from 1968 and Apollo 8. But this image was important because in some ways it birthed the modern environmental movement. Now you could argue that actually there was a pantheist animism of an environmental movement which was deeply embedded in indigenous cultures right from the moment of human origins. But this image sticks in our minds because it was only a few years later that the first World Environment Day took place in 1972, the year I was born. Now, the theme of that World Environment Day, off the back of the Club of Rome, limits to growth, and those type of investigations was only one Earth. And we've cycled right back to that same theme for World Environment Day this year. So having spent 25 years, over half my life, working on issues like climate change, we have to ask the question, what progress have we actually made? And in some respects, it can feel like the planet's looking at us and going, are you guys not listening to what is going on out here? In a kind of I'm with stupid type of fashion. Because if the war in Ukraine has proved one thing, apart from the tragedy of the return to violence in Europe and the carnage and the humanitarian crisis and the displacement and death, it's our inherent interconnectedness. And the energy crises and the food crises which are now unfolding show exactly how we are all inextricably linked. And when you look at what is going on out there in the world, it can feel like the apocalypse. But I don't mean that in the Armageddon, end of the world sense. I mean that in the true etymology of the word, the true root of the word, the uncovering, the revelation, the drawing back of the veil to show the world as it actually is. And my job as a futurist is not to predict and analyze existing trends, but to stretch the imagination of the possible. And in order to do that, you have to listen very carefully to the real questions the future is asking of us. Now, I speak at a lot of events. This one I would describe as one of the more sublime. I spoke recently at a lawnmower conference. I get all the glamour gigs. That might be construed as the ridiculous. But this ladies and gentlemen, is a 125-mile-an-hour lawnmower. Now, I don't know what question these guys think the future is asking them, but I'm pretty sure it's not, where's my 125-mile-an-hour lawnmower? Now, I do a podcast with a British comedian who you may not have heard of, John Richardson, and my fellow reluctant futurist, Mark Stevenson, who I believe spoke to you a few years ago. John Richardson and the Futurenauts. We call this the Book of Revelations. And in this podcast, we take a different topic each week and we ask 3 questions. How fucked are we? Why are we fucked? And how do we unfuck ourselves? So I'm going to use that format broadly for the rest of this talk. So, how fucked are we? Those of you who are South Park fans will know this is the alien space probe episode. Well, as I said, I've worked on climate change for half my life. It has felt like a chronicle of a tragedy foretold. We've all watched this come towards us with the grim predictability of a white swan. Soft denial has shifted to a moment of dramatic realization of where exactly we find ourselves. And I put it to you, we've been telling ourselves 3 key comfortable myths. 1, we feel like we know what's going on and what's likely to happen over the next 5 to 15 years. Secondly, that we've got a sense of control and that whatever happens, we'll find a way to handle it. And thirdly, that we understand what leadership will be required and that our decision-making institutions are up to the job. Now, as speaking as a Brit, I would say I have some serious questions about our leadership and our decision-making institutions. Now, 2.5 years ago, I gave a talk at the Bank of England on what we call low probability but very high impact risks. And this was pre-pandemic, it was January 2020. And we looked at the tail end of that distribution, those things which are unlikely to happen, but when they do, have enormous impact. And we talked about extreme climate change off the back of the Australian fires. We talked about the potential for pandemics and economic crises. Now we have all 3 with war layered on top. So we have to be very cautious about the long tail of the distribution. Now, COVID has meant that we've all become very familiar with the flattening of the curve, the bringing in measures to draw down the number of cases within the healthcare system carrying capacity. But climate change is exactly the same. Without climate protective measures, we cannot hope to get climate change below 2 degrees or even to the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement, which is pretty much lost. And as Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, said, we can't self-isolate from climate change. And if you haven't read the 3,000 pages of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, let me summarize very quickly. It's unequivocal, it's us, it's unprecedented. Indeed, some of the changes are now inevitable, and on human timescales, irreversible. And it's only going to get hotter. We're enjoying blazing July temperatures this week. We've added 1.1 degrees since 1850. We're pretty much going to get 1.5 by 2040 in all the scenarios. The past 7 years have been the hottest on record. It's only going one way. The question is, how hot do we allow it to get? Temperatures in New Delhi recently hit 55 degrees. That's hot enough to melt the tarmac on the streets. That's how ferocious that heat is, considerably hotter than what we're experiencing here. And when you combine that with humidity, you get what scientists call the wet bulb effect, which means your perspiration cannot evaporate. So you don't get the latent heat of evaporation, you can't cool off, and healthy people die in the shade. Somewhere between half and 2/3 of humanity could be facing those type of conditions by the end of the century if we don't do something about this. And for those of you who are sci-fi fans, I imagine there might be 1 or 2 in the room, Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote, obviously, the Mars trilogy, his Ministry of the Future opens up with a heat wave in India which kills 2 million people. Exactly this type of wet bulb effect type of tragedy. Because the weather is also getting extreme. When you put all of this additional heat into the system, it becomes more violent. You know, it doesn't matter what your area you're looking at, increased precipitation, heat waves, the intensity of cyclones, the droughts, or the fire seasons, all of them are getting more intense. That's just what happens when you put more energy into the system. And that also has, obviously, significant financial costs. The impacts of these are now running to tens of billions of dollars a year. And some people now in the financial markets are starting to talk about the risk of an uninsurable world, where the costs of these premiums become untenable as the costs of the impacts spiral out of control. And we've got a huge gap to close. If you look at the blue band on this graph, that is basically where our current policies and actions and pledges not binding, pledges are going to take us, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees of climate change. And the green line, the very steep decline, is where we need to be. And right now we have a 20 gigaton gap to close, a 20 gigaton ambition gap to close by the end of this decade, in the next 8 years, on your watch, on our watch, on my watch. Antonio Guterres put it pretty succinctly, UN Secretary General. He said, delay is death. This is already killing 400,000 people a year through climate-related deaths. It's only going to get worse. But it's not just climate, it's also the web of life. The most powerful review on this topic done by the UK government, the Das Gupta review, looking at nature-related financial risks, identified these physical risks, the ones I've just been talking about from extreme weather, the transition risks, and also the litigation risks as everything becomes more volatile. There's 1,800 climate change-related lawsuits active globally right now. And there's a reason for this, is because our natural capital, and I hate that sort of terminology, but over the last 25 years, our natural capital has declined by 40% per person. That's the value of all of the ecosystem processes and services that keep the whole show of life on the road. And we need to acknowledge how brutal this has been. Humanity has wiped out 60% of all mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles since 1970, while we have had a global environmental consciousness awakening and while we have all been in charge. 60% of all of those animals with backbones gone in our lifetime. Just hold that thought for a moment and hold that feeling. We've also seen a 75% decline in insect populations in the last 25 years. Where I live in Norfolk, the farming area of East Anglia, when I was growing up there in the 70s, we used to talk about driving at night as like the moth snowstorm, because it was like the Millennium Falcon going into hyperspace with all the insects coming out of the headlights hitting the windscreen. You drive at night now, almost nothing. That's the basis of our terrestrial food chain. Worse is the shifting baseline syndrome. I used to be a marine biologist, a fisheries biologist, is when we realize that the level of nature we experience is an incredibly denuded version of what should be there. It's a diminished version, and every generation is experiencing that level of poverty as normal, not the natural fecundity and bounty and beauty that should be there. And that matters, because that's why we end up treating everything in this utilitarian and instrumental way. Why we treat soil not as a vibrant, interdependent collection of complementary and symbiotic living organisms, all working together as a team, but as a banal growth medium that we bombard with agrochemicals. And we're rinsing this. We're not treating it like community. So all this adds up to what we might call The Big Short. You've probably seen The Big Short, the Hollywood movie, which is all about the collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps that the financial markets created, which weren't underpinned by the requisite financial capital. So when the music stopped playing, the whole show fell down. We are engaged right now in the Big Short of ecology, where all of our human activities and endeavors are not underpinned by the requisite natural and ecological capital. It's becoming brittle and fragile. And most of the world's economy is dependent on this in some way. About half the world's GDP is directly dependent on nature. And in some ways, people talk about this as the sixth mass extinction event, looking back. But actually, I prefer to call it the first mass extermination event, because we are conscious of what we are doing. We are doing this in full knowledge of the damage that is being wrought through the web of life. So consider this as a series of waves. We've had the pandemic wave, we've had the economic recession wave, we've got the climate change wave, and the biodiversity collapse wave coming up behind. It's not going to get easy, because all of these waves are going to break over us. And one of my favorite gurus, the management specialist Charles Handy, said this is an age of unreason, where we actually have to start to have more bold imagining of thinking the unlikely and actually beginning to do the genuinely unreasonable. So if I cycle back to those three key comfortable myths, I put it to you that actually we face three key uncomfortable truths. There's a whole bunch of unknowns coming down the track towards us. that we are not in control. And it would be arrogant and hubristic to suggest otherwise, and I think the last 3 years has proven that beyond doubt. And thirdly, that leadership is just part of the mix for responsible organizing. And actually, we're going to be heavily reliant on grassroots innovation and localized resilience to help us manage what's coming. And it's not just me saying this. As a director of Greenpeace, the World Economic Forum pretty much has half its long-term risks identified as being environmentally related, whether it's weather, biodiversity loss, or infectious disease, because you guys will be familiar with the fact that we've enjoyed this relatively stable period of the Holocene for the last few thousand years, during which most of human civilization has evolved and flourished. And we're about to bounce ourselves out of that. Some people call it the Anthropocene, and we can get very caught up on the terminology here. Some people call it the Capitalocene, where our pursuit of infinite growth on a finite planet and the need for that recapitalized growth on a constant and ongoing basis is leading us into this turmoil. Some people also say it's the Technocene, where our obsession with a sort of techno-optimism is also compounding our problems. And you'll be familiar with the background of this slide, which is from The Matrix. You might not know, actually, that what is being shared there on The Matrix is sushi recipes. But that's your little fact for the day. But in summary, as they said in the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, we're in a tight spot. We're in a really tight spot here. And whether it's going to be a Star Trek or Mad Max future, I think is very much in the balance. And we can see elements of both out there right now. And perhaps, you know, as Enrico Fermi said in his paradox, maybe this is the great filter. Maybe this is the moment that we bump up against. The fact that the reason we don't hear from anyone else is because it's very difficult to get through this filter. And trust me, we're not doing very well at getting through this filter right now. So why are we in this mess? How do we allow it to get this bad? Why is the last 50 years, despite elements of progress, a bit of a disaster? Well, partly it's to do with the Great Acceleration. The Stockholm, I try not to put too many graphs in a presentation, and I cheat by putting 24 on one slide. But it doesn't matter which of these you look at, whether it's world population in the top left-hand corner, primary energy use, or my old job as a marine fisheries biologist. Pretty much all of these graphs go exponential around the same point, 1950. Now, that's population growth, I hear you say, which is partly true, because in 1900, there was 1.6 billion people on the planet, and now there's 7.6 billion. But it's actually more about population and consumption, because 50% of those global carbon lifestyle emissions come from 10% of the global population. So population plays a factor, but our consumption is what is really driving this. As they say in the movie Fight Club, we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't like who largely don't care. And that is the hedonic treadmill of materialism. And Johan Rockström, who was responsible for putting some of those charts together at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, said this is the planet starting to send back invoices to the economy. This is the paying back of that ecological debt that we have accrued. And the trouble is, we then use our technological insight and wizardry to make it worse. As Bill Gates said, if you apply automation to an inefficient operation, you just magnify the inefficiency. It enables you to do worse things with greater productivity and make the situation get even worse. So I'm concerned that a lot of our artificial intelligence actually leads us into a position of artificial stupidity. And what we really need to be doing is finding much more radically efficient and innovative ways of doing things and then magnifying those. Food is a classic example because 30 to 50% of the food we produce never even reaches a human stomach. We're talking about a food crisis now off the back of Ukraine, and yet our profligacy is incredible. And that matters because already we look at the planet itself. You know it's 70% ocean, so we've only got about 30% of the planet is land, about 70% of that is habitable, and about 50% of that, the green band there, is used for agriculture. So we use most of it for agriculture, but worse, we use most of it to grow food to feed animals that we then eat. So the most of the land is actually generating food for the animals that we consume, not calories for we ourselves. So grotesque inefficiencies and perversions in the way we use land. And people think this is because we've got this notion of inexorable progress, that we keep on going in the right direction, that every generation enjoys a better quality of life than the generation that came before them. And I put it to you that that is a bit of a progress myth, particularly in terms of where we find ourselves. because we aren't necessarily inherently civilizing. We're not coming down from the trees and ending up planting trees. What we're doing right now is creating progress traps, where our pursuit of progress is creating conditions and impacts which are undermining our potential for future progress. And energy is a classic one in this regard, because we've said we need energy in order to develop, but when that energy is predicated on fossil fuels, which generate the carbon emissions which drive climate change, it's a reinforcing negative feedback loop which is driving us over the edge. And then there's the kind of edge of space willy waving of who can stick their member further over the Kármán line, and this commercialization of space. And as an environmentalist, I echo John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club in the States. He said, we're not blindly opposed to progress, but we are opposed to blind progress. And I think in many senses our progress is partially sighted. My old job as a marine biologist reveals things like this. Plastic bags found at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point of the ocean on the planet. 10 kilometers down, human impact being found in those abyssal depths. Incidentally, we've been to the Mariana Trench 3 times. We've been to the moon 12 times. So you've got 12 people have stepped on the moon, only 3 people have been down to the bottom of the sea. And you would have all been seeing the kind of the debris being found on Mars, with the rubbish coming from the rover, and Elon Musk's desire to send the first commercial production vehicle into space. That was a hot competition, that one. But on a positive note, you'll recognize Vanguard 1, which obviously was one of the first solar panels in space. These little tiny, 5 centimeter square, 1 watt output, generating solar power for the first time. And obviously we can see how solar power has begun to transform the world of energy globally. But Vanguard 1 is still up there. And you guys know the problem that is coming now, particularly in terms of this growth of the commercialization of space, and the thousands of objects that everyone says they're going to be putting up by the end of the decade. Something like 36,500 bigger than 10 centimeter fragments, 1 million between 1 and 10 centimeters, 130 million possibly, we don't really know, it's quite hard to measure objects smaller than a centimeter in space, all traveling at 7 kilometers a second, which is pretty deadly if you're a spacecraft. And you don't want these things to get in your way. And worse is the kind of Kessler syndrome, where we might get the collision cascades. If one object gets taken out, it creates more debris, which creates this knock-on effect. And I think that's to do with our mindset, the way we've treated space. You will have seen the movie Don't Look Up with Leonardo DiCaprio, where the intergalactic asteroid is coming out of deep space as if from nowhere. And no one wants to look up. People don't want to see what is coming. And in many respects, that climate change metaphor is incredibly apposite. And willful blindness is actually a legal principle. I work on this a lot with businesses. You are responsible if you could have known, or indeed should have known, something instead which you chose or strove not to see. And I go back to an old friend of mine, Dr. Martin Shaw, who works on myth. And he said, the problems we've got here is we've fallen out of a very ancient love affair, a kind of dream tangle with the earth itself. We've perhaps been seduced by what lies beyond. Because I think that mindset of what the colonial forces hit somewhere like Australia, where they described it as terra nullius, no one's land, which allowed exploitation, commercialization, subordination, all sorts of abhorrent behaviors, is now being applied to space. Ex terra nullius, if you like. No one's space, so everyone is up for a sort of free-for-all grab. And that relationship is part of the problem. Because if we come at this with the wrong sort of relationship, it's a bit like ditching the Earth and already flirting with one eye on Mars in some kind of planetary bigamy. Like we're hedging our bets about where we might want to go next. And I think this is a mirror moment where we look very hard at ourselves in the mirror. Now, do we see Narcissus, that sort of form of self-love, where our incredible technology is a form of self-adulation by proxy? Or are we able to have the right catharsis through the other great human constructions of philosophy, morality, and art to do things radically differently? Because otherwise, we're in the old lady who swallowed a fly type of moment. And we all know the nursery rhyme. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider, and so on and so forth, which is where often our technological progress takes us, where we're always trying to find the next solution, geoengineering being the next one in regard to the climate crisis. And I think we need to close that honesty gap and ask ourselves that very difficult question. It's like, well, how is this technology being used and where is it taking us? Because otherwise, and you'll be familiar with my favorite English word, which is serendipity, the idea of experiencing happy accidents of good fortune by going out there into the world. But unfortunately, what the climate and ecological crisis is showing us is that actually what we're confronting is zemblanity, which is making continually unhappy and unlucky discoveries by design, because we know where we're headed. So that's how fucked we are, and a bit about why. Let's finish on a high note. So how do we unfuck ourselves? How do we get out of this mess? Well, partly this is about the reimagination of the way we do things. One of our biggest challenges is poverty of imagination that we see from so many of our political and business leaders right now. Where is the real imagination that can capture the hearts and minds of people? One thing I learned when I went around the world without flying is it was very similar to the overview effect experienced by astronauts. When they see that interconnected, interdependent vulnerability and fragility of the Earth from space, it often has a transformative effect on them ecologically. And I had a similar thing by traveling through the world rather than over it. You know, the kind of context and the gentle transition of landscape, culture, people, language, cuisine made me realize that what connected us all was far more powerful than that which divided us. And it's that overview effect which is so important to understand the systemic changes that we have to make. Our economy right now is primarily degenerative. And actually, even sustainability is like a damage limitation exercise, doing the same things in a slightly less shit way. And what we need to do is get onto that regenerative pathway. Because ultimately, the past is history. What we're doing right now is just a sticking plaster on the open wound. And where we really need to go is that regenerative future, which is the only viable future. And that's going to mean a shift in the mindset from that exploitative, commercial, extractive, colonial type of approach to actually embracing the ability of all living things and ecosystems and beings to replicate, regenerate, and recreate. Because ultimately, I get very peed off with environmentalists who keep talking about saving the world, changing the world. So the planet doesn't need to be saved or changed or even rescued. It just needs to be loved. And as Robin Wall Kimmerer, the beautiful writer who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, says, to love a place is not enough. We must find ways to heal it. Because right now, home is in severe and urgent need of healing. The good news is we have some plans. This is the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. We're trying to protect 30% of the land and 30% of the ocean by the end of this decade, by 2030. So 30% by 2030, a third of the planet. Some biologists, such as E.O. Wilson, think we should go further and have half the world for nature, which feels like a pretty fair split to me, if we could get there. And I know there's been some fantastic work done, particularly by ESA and all of these Earth observation missions, which are bringing us the data we need. But wisdom is more important than information. It's what we now do with that insight. And one thing we have not been short of over the last 50 years is that insight. We've been knowing what's going on for 5 decades. And people, again, have talked about this for a long time. Buckminster Fuller famously talking about Spaceship Earth, the fact that we're not passengers, we're all crew on this vessel. And Ellen MacArthur, who started the Ellen MacArthur Circular Economy Foundation after sailing around the world on her yacht and realizing that when you were out in the open ocean doing a solo round-the-world yacht race, all you have is all you have with you. And so you have to be innovative and resourceful. And that's what we need you guys to do. is to help us with that same pioneering ingenuity that brought solar power, pollution remediation, water purification, those technologies which are first pioneered in space and are now becoming absolutely invaluable for the transformation we have to make down here on Earth right now. And that's where we're going to be getting the answers from, because in some ways, this is the shakedown. There are some organizations that can grasp where the future needs to go. And they are the ones with the bravery and courage to know what needs to be done, to do the unreasonable, to have that bold imagining, and to think the unlikely. And there are those organizations which are dead, which are putting the brakes on change, which are holding us back from the inevitable transition, and they deserve to die. Because it's probably going to get better and worse at the same time in the coming decades. My daughter is 5 years old. She will most likely still be around in 2100 when we're talking about these 3 or 4 degrees of potential climate change and perhaps even a couple of meters of sea level rise. Because any return to normal when we talk about the commercialization of space, or even the commercialization of anything in building back our economies after the pandemic, it's a bit like Darth Vader saying the construction of our new Death Star is an amazing job creation opportunity. Yes, Darth, but it also destroys planets. So if I put it any more bluntly, I think any investment right now of time or money that doesn't center human health or the environment isn't investment. It's actually a theft of our future. It's a theft of our future potential of where we might go to next. And that is an uncomfortable truth to have to try and grasp. My colleague Margaret Heffernan at the Forward Institute, when I work on responsible leadership, said the truth won't set us free until we develop the skills, the habits, the talents, but perhaps most importantly, the moral courage to use it. And believe me, this is a time of moral courage because, as an evolutionary biologist would say, we like to think that change happens nice and smoothly in an easily manageable fashion, these lovely long, slow curves. But it doesn't. That phyletic gradualism is actually more like punctuated equilibria. We have long periods of stability, followed by periods of rapid, brutal, urgent, and quite uncomfortable change. That is right where we are right now. Because as another sci-fi writer, William Gibson, said, the future's out there, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And I'm very lucky because I get to work with so many of the organizations and be aware of so many of the projects around the world which are already living the future we need right now. But they're atomized, they're isolated, they need scaling urgently. Equally, the collapse is out there. It's just not evenly distributed yet. So you can see these dualities panning out in front of us. And a few years ago at the Hay Festival, the literary festival in England, I saw a quote from a Tibetan Buddhist script which said, the wise learn from the past, but the brave learn from the future. And so we're not going to be able to use necessarily the lessons from history to navigate this difficult terrain. We're going to have to learn to listen to the questions that the future is asking of us. And that requires a shift from what we might call an anthropocentric, ego-led view of instrumental utilitarianism, where everything is up for grabs for us, for our use and for our benefit, through perhaps an ecocentricity, where we can actually at least see ourselves as part of that interconnected family and web of life. And I would push that further to the Sanskrit idea of seva, which is to be in service to life, putting us at the bottom as the responsible parents and architects of a world that is served. What would a space program that was in service to all life look like? What would it feel like? What shape would it be? And in that sense, what we need now is cathedral projects. Things like Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, Gaudi's incredibly powerful vision being realized decades later. And that is what space programs do best, to have their eyes on the far-sighted horizon, to create beauty and innovation that actually has impacts and implementation potentials down here on Earth. I took this photo in Norwich Cathedral last year because I thought it was an amazing juxtaposition of a brontosaurus skeleton, Dippy, who used to be in the Natural History Museum, laid out above those stone arcs in the nave of the cathedral, the juxtaposition of the bones and the ceiling. And I think that's what we have to comprehend, is that we are going to be in the dippy position unless we can get this cathedral thinking correct. The ISS has perhaps been the best example of that cathedral-like thinking in space, and this morning's images that were coming out from the James Webb Space Telescope, launched yesterday, also giving us that deep 13 billion year insight into the origins and early days of the universe. Those are the things that we need to be doing, because this is an extraordinary emergency. It really is. It's unprecedented in human history. And it's going to require an extraordinary emergence from us to do something radically different. And I think it also requires a return to that sense of reverence, that sense of reverence to the night sky and the space beyond. And this is me lying on the ground in Patagonia, a very wonderful dark sky spot, and then high up on the Patagonian plateau, enjoying the Milky Way. And our ancestors had that reverence, that holy relationship with the heavens, which in some ways, the commercialization of space starts to look incredibly crass when we get into that position. Because ultimately, whilst Elon Musk might have his eyes on Mars and various other oligarchs are buying up their estates in New Zealand for any potential forthcoming societal collapse, what we've really learned over the course of the last few years, whether it's in the context of civil rights, or whether it's in the context of the pandemic, or whether it's in the context of climate change, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And these things sound obvious and trite, but why do we need to be constantly reminded of them? Because it is like the old story that David Foster Wallace, the US writer, used to tell about two goldfish swimming along. And one goldfish turns to the other and says, "How's the water?" And the other goldfish says, "What the hell is water?" And these are the things that we swim in, but we forget how important they are. And we need to bring them back to the fore of our thinking. Because we have projections going on all around us right now. You have both projected hope and projected hopelessness. We have some of that projected hope, which comes from the slightly messianic techno-utopian optimism, the promise to fix everything with a revolutionary and messianic fervor. And on the hopelessness side, you have the sort of fatalism and resignation and the misanthropic nihilism that comes from the fact that it's all our fault, humanity's not very nice, and we deserve everything we get. Both are projections. Where we need to do is to stand on the tightrope between those two cliffs of possibility with humor, humility, and hyper self-reflectivity, to keep on asking ourselves the most difficult of questions. Because that is what being genuinely planetary is about. It is about trying to find the best of ourselves, the creative, collaborative, regenerative future that is possible, rather than the worst of ourselves, which is the extractive, commercialized, colonial, and exploitative side. And it's touch and go, depending on which way this is going to turn out. But for me, the answer to those questions is the space for inspiration, and I'm sure that Earth is not our final frontier. And I'll finish with the inevitable Carl Sagan quote. We'll look back and realize how vulnerable the repository of all our potential was, how perilous our infancy, how humble our beginnings, how many rivers we had to cross before we found our way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you.